story of a former millionaire.
Do you believe hell is real? This is a question that many avoid, but few can forget. For many, it is just an abstract idea, a distant concept used to scare. But what if I told you that hell is more real than anything you could imagine? What if I revealed to you that it is not just a place of eternal suffering, but a destiny that many choose without even realizing it? What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It is a testimony that can change the course of your life. The revelation he brought from hell are frightening, unsettling, and, above all, true. There, I saw torments that go beyond human understanding, the incessant crying of souls who once believed they were safe, and the screams of those begging for a second chance. Imagine a place where the fire never goes out, where the air is filled with the suffocating smell of sulfur, and where every scream echoes like an eternal reminder of wrong choices. In hell, there is no silence, there is no rest, and the pain has no end. Everything I saw made me understand a cruel truth. Many live as if hell did not exist, but walk directly towards it. And you? Ever wondered what happens after your heart stops beating? Curiosity about eternity has tormented humanity since ancient time. Questions like, where am I going? What will become of my soul? Or, is there anything after death? Continue to pursue us. Hell is not a distant idea. It is closer than you think, and the choices we make daily can lead us to that destination. While many seek comfort in the idea that they are good people or that they have plenty of time to change their lives, the truth is much harsher. Hell doesn't wait. He is relentless, seductive, and always on the prowl, ready to grab those who leave doors open in their lives. Maybe you think you're safe, that these revelations have nothing to do with you. But do they really have it? There, I saw people of all ages and backgrounds. There were those who were proud of their wealth and power, but who in the end had nothing but regret. There were those who ignored small warning, thinking that nothing could happen to them. And there were also those who were mistaken, thinking that hell was just a myth. But they all shared the same fate, an eternity of torment. And these souls, who once had the same doubts as you, now scream for their mistakes to be heard. I saw this with my own eyes. Hell is not a fable. It is a real place, full of revelations that God allowed me to bring to you. And today, I need to share everything I saw. If you think you know enough about hell, I dare you to keep listening. For what is coming will challenge everything you believe, will shake your understanding of eternity, and perhaps completely transform your life. So, I ask you once again, what would you do if you knew hell was real? That it is not just a possibility, a choice is being made right now, by me, by you, by all of us. The answers you are about to hear are not just words. They are a wake-up call, a chance to reflect before it is too late. Hell is not just the destiny of sinners, but of all who ignore the sign. And today, I want to reveal every detail of what I saw there. And in light of all this, I want to extend an invitation to you. Shall we pray together? Prayer is the most powerful weapon we have against the traps of hell. It is through it that we strengthen our connection with God, find direction for our lives, and close the doors that the enemy tries to open. Prayer has the power to transform reality, change destinies, and bring light to the darkest places. Leave your prayer request here in the comments. No matter what your struggle is, whether you are facing spiritual difficulties, family problems, or just feel like you need to grow closer to God, I want to pray for you. This is the time to hand everything over to Him and allow Him to act in your life. What's more, by liking this video, you help this message reach other people who may need this revelation right now. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content that can transform your life. Together, we can continue to spread the truth and help others understand the weight of the choices we make every day. So, leave your prayer, request, like this video, and share this message with those you love. Hell is real, but God is greater, and together we can seek the salvation and transformation that only He can give us. Let's pray. The life of riches seemed perfect. It all started with a simple desire to conquer the world and be recognized as someone successful. Money, power, and influence were the pillars of an ambition that, at first, seemed harmless. And so began the journey of a man who, in the ease of society, had everything. He accumulated assets that others only dreamed of, luxurious mansions with breathtaking views, sports cars that symbolized status, exclusive trips to paradisiacal destinations where he was treated like royalty. His name was synonymous with success, and he became the aspirational role model for many. However, what no one saw, not even he could admit it, was the emptiness that grew inside his soul. Everything he built seemed grand, but there was something money couldn't buy: inner peace. There were nights when, even surrounded by all the symbols of success, he would sit in absolute silence, staring at the ceiling of his room as one question echoed in his mind: is this all there is? The glow of achievements soon turned to shadows when he tried to sleep, and the fake smiles he received at lavish dinners couldn't drown out the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Why, even with everything he had, did his soul remain thirsty? This emptiness, which began as a slight restlessness, soon became a black hole that sucked away her joy. He tried to fill it in every way the world offered: endless parties, superficial relationships, extravagances that would make anyone question the logic of spending so much. But nothing worked. Each new acquisition, each achievement greater than the previous one, seemed to be just a temporary palliative, something that filled the moment, but soon left the same bitter feeling that something was missing. It was as if his soul was always asking for something he couldn't name, something he couldn't buy or achieve. It was then that he began to notice something strange. The people around him were disappearing, not literally, but emotionally. Friends who were once by your side at all times began to distance themselves. Some, he later discovered, were just there for what he could offer. Others turned away because they could not bear the darkness that seemed to begin to surround him. He found himself increasingly alone, even among crowds. The man who had everything began to experience isolation in a way that no amount of wealth could prevent. However, he could not identify the root of his problem. Sometimes I thought maybe I was just tired, that I needed a new goal, a new challenge. Other times, he convinced himself that the problem was with the people around him, who weren't loyal or good enough. But deep down, he knew the problem was within himself. There was something he didn't understand, something that seemed to be eating away at his soul from the inside out. It was as if he was trapped in a vicious cycle of self-sabotage, where every attempt to find relief only deepened the emptiness. Little by little, he began to lose control. Not in financial terms, those numbers were still impressive, but in terms of his mental and emotional health. Anxiety and insomnia became his constant companion. He began to be tormented by nightmares, dreams in which he fell into an endless abyss, where accusing voices chased him. He would wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, but unable to remember exactly what he had dreamed, only with the feeling that something dark was lurking, something he couldn't ignore. It was at this stage that he began to listen to advice that he previously ignored. People who said he should seek something bigger than himself, something spiritual. Although he resisted the idea, thinking he could solve his problems alone, he couldn't deny that his life was falling apart inside. And, ironically, it was at this most fragile moment that a seemingly innocent offer crossed his path. A solution that promised to bring what he most wanted, a meaning for his life and relief from the weight he carried. He was willing to do anything. The anguish had reached a point where money seemed useless, and he knew that if he didn't find something, he could lose everything. The emptiness was no longer just emotional. It was starting to affect his physical health. He felt inexplicable pain, constant pressure in his chest, and a feeling that he couldn't breathe. It was as if he was carrying an invisible burden, something he couldn't identify, but that was slowly destroying him. At that point in his life, he didn't know it yet, but he was about to make a choice that would change everything. A decision that would take him down a path from which there may be no return. a path that would open doors he would never have imagined. Walking through doors that would connect him to something much bigger and much darker than he could understand. What seemed like the answer to all his problems was actually the beginning of a journey that would take him straight into the heart of darkness. Hell was waiting, and he had no idea what he was about to find. In a desperate search for relief from the emptiness that gnawed at his soul, he found something that seemed like the perfect solution. At one of the luxurious parties I used to tend, someone approached me with a proposal that seemed, at first glance, like a golden opportunity. It was a subtle conversation, full of insinuations and promises that touched directly on his deepest desire. "Have you ever thought about achieving something beyond what you have already achieved?" they said. The phrase seemed innocent, but it was enough to spark his curiosity. The man who already had everything found himself intrigued by the idea of even more absolute power, something that no one could ever take away from him. In the days that followed, he couldn't get this conversation out of his head. The promise was seductive, tempting, but there was something about it that seemed to carry a different weight. It was as if he knew, deep in his soul, that this was not a simple invitation, but a contract, an exchange that involved more than material, goods or power. Even so, his concern was so great that he decided to go further. He decided to investigate, question, and in the end, accept the invitation to a meeting that would change everything. The night it all happened started like any other, but there was something strange in the air. He was taken to a place that seemed isolated, far from any civilization. It wasn't a fancy office or a luxurious meeting room, but a dark, almost ritualistic place. Upon entering, he noticed that the people around him seemed to know exactly what they were doing. He, on the other hand, felt out of place. His curiosity kept him there. A man, who appeared to be the host, began to speak. His words were captivating, almost mesmerizing. He talked about power, about total freedom, and about how the most successful men in history hadn't made it to the top without sacrificing something greater. With each sentence, he found himself more convinced that this was the answer he was looking for. After all, he had already lost so much emotionally that a small sacrifice, he thought, wouldn't make a difference. It was then that the contract was placed before him. It was a simple document, but the weight he felt holding it was indescribable. He tried to laugh at himself, saying that maybe he was imagining things, but deep down, he knew it was more than just paper and ink. The host's words echoed in his mind. "What you sign today will open doors that can never be closed again." Despite his nervousness, he remained convinced that this was the next step. The temptation to feel complete, to fill that void that tormented him, was irresistible. Without hesitating much longer, he signed, and in that moment, something inside him changed. He felt a chill run through his body, something he couldn't explain. It was as if an invisible presence surrounded him, watching him. Although no one else in the room seemed to notice, he felt he had crossed a barrier that could never be undone. But instead of regretting it, he forced himself to ignore the feeling. After all, the benefits began to appear almost immediately. In the following weeks, everything seemed to improve. Businesses that were stagnant began to prosper in an inexplicable way. Influential people sought him out, offering partnerships that were previously unimaginable. He felt invincible, as if he had finally found the secret to absolute success. However, while everything seemed to be going well externally, something inside him began to crumble. In the silence of the nights, the nightmares returned, more intense than ever. He dreamed of dark places, filled with screams and flames that never went out. In his dreams, he heard voices that accused him, voices that said, "You know what you did, now pay the price." He would wake up panting, in a cold sweat, and no matter how much he tried to convince himself that they were just dreams, the fear grew. He began to notice that the darkness he felt inside him was different from what he had ever experienced before. This wasn't just a void, it was a present. Furthermore, strange things started to happen around him. He saw shadows in the corners of his eyes, heard whispers when he was alone, and felt a constant pressure in his chest, as if something was trying to suffocate him. He tried to ignore it, but the evidence was increasingly clear. That contract he signed was not a simple business agreement. It was something much deeper, something spiritual, and he was beginning to realize that he had made a fatal mistake. But what could he do? He felt trapped, chained to a choice he couldn't undo. There were times when he tried to seek help, but shame and fear of appearing weak held him back. After all, he was the man who had everything, who was admired by everyone. How could he admit that he was being tormented by forces he himself did not understand? And this is where I ask, have you ever done something that seemed right at the time, but later turned out to be a mistake with consequences you couldn't imagine? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where every choice seemed to take you closer to something you didn't want to face? If so, leave it in the comments, write consequences, or share an experience. Remember, your story can help others who are facing something similar. The weeks that followed the signing of the pact seemed like a dream, or at least that was how he preferred to see it. Everything around finally seemed to align. What once seemed impossible began to happen with ease, as if the universe was conspiring in your favor. Businesses that were stuck suddenly prospered. People who never paid attention to him now sought his approval. Social events became stages for his greatness, and he finally began to feel that the void within him had been filled. But what seemed like a victory was, in fact, the beginning of his downfall. It all started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Small coincidences that seemed unimportant began to gain weight over time. He noticed that his patience was becoming shorter, as if something inside him was constantly irritated, ready to explode. Those closest to him began to comment that he looked different. "Are you well?" they asked, with a look of concern. Heelways answered yes, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The feeling of control he thought he had gained was slowly slipping from his grasp, and he didn't know how to stop it. Soon, his health began to suffer. Sleep, which was already disturbed by recurring nightmares, became almost non-existent. He spent sleepless nights sitting up in his bed, his head spinning with thoughts he couldn't control. The silence of the early morning seemed to amplify every noise, every shadow he saw out of the corner of his eyes. The smell of sulfur began to appear out of nowhere, invading his home without explanation, and the weight in his chest was so strong that sometimes he felt like he couldn't breathe. He found himself alone, surrounded by a darkness that seemed alive, pulsating, as if hell had begun to invade his reality. His business, which initially seemed to flourish, began to get complicated. Mistakes he would never have made before began to appear in contracts, investments failed, and partners who'd previously sought him out began to avoid him. He felt isolated, like the world was falling apart around him, but he still tried to maintain the facade that everything was fine. He was known as a successful man, someone who could not show weakness or defeat. But with each passing day, it was as if an invisible force was pulling the reins of his life, leading him into an abyss from which he could not escape. It was in the moments of greatest silence that the torment became unbearable. Voices began to emerge, no longer in his dreams, but now during the day. He heard whispers in languages he couldn't understand, words that seemed to repeat themselves, echoing in his mind without rest. There were times when he would see figures passing quickly in the corners of his vision, but when he looked directly, nothing was there. He began to question his sanity, wondering if this was all a figment of his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. He knew there was something darker going on, something he couldn't control. One day, while he was at his mansion, something happened that he would never forget. He was in his office, trying to review business papers, when he heard a sound coming from one of the rooms. It was like the dragging of furniture, but there was no one in the house but him. He went to where the sound was coming from, and when he opened the door, the air inside the room was heavy, almost suffocating. The temperature seemed to have dropped drastically, and he felt a presence. There was no one there, but he knew he wasn't alone. It was then that he heard for the first time, clearly, a deep and cold voice saying, "You belong to us." At that moment, he felt as if his entire body was paralyzed. The presence was so strong that he could barely breathe. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come out. All he could do was lie there, motionless, as he felt the weight of that entity crushing him. When he finally managed to move, he ran out of the room and locked the door, as if that would stop her from following him. But he knew he couldn't run away. This presence was not limited to that space. She followed him wherever he went. The following days were true chaos. He started avoiding public places, afraid that something similar would happen. He felt that people could perceive his storm, that they could see the shadow that now accompanied him. He stopped answering calls, responding to messages, and completely isolated himself in his mansion. He tried to look for answers, but everything seemed in vain. The few times he tried to open up to someone about what was happening, he was met with disbelief or looks of pity. Little by little, he began to realize that what he had signed that fateful night was not just a symbolic contract. He had handed over something far more precious than money or material possession. He had given his soul. And now, the weight of that decision was something he couldn't bear. He began to question everything, his life, his choices, and whether there would ever be a way out of the torment he was experiencing. Now, I ask, have you ever felt trapped by something that seemed bigger than you? Something that consumes your peace and leaves you without direction? Write "torment" in the comments or share your reflection. Your participation could be a light in the life of someone who is facing the same thing. The supernatural encounter, the journey to hell. The night everything changed was like any other. He was alone, as was often the case. Ash no longer had the courage to invite anyone to his home. The environment felt too charged, and the mere idea of allowing anyone into his bubble of darkness scared him. He was in the room, sitting on the bed, his body tired, but unable to sleep. The silence, which should have been a refuge, was disturbing. There was something in the air that seemed alive, pulsating, as if the environment was being observed. It was as if every shadow on the walls was whispering, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. That night, he was overcome by the weight of fear. As he closed his eyes, he felt as if he was being pulled. It wasn't an ordinary sleep, but something that took him away from reality. His breathing was labored, his heart was beating out of control, but his body was still. He didn't know if he was dreaming or awake, but everything around him started to change. He was no longer in his room. Everything went dark, and the smell of sulfur took over his senses. The feeling of suffocation increased, as if the air around him was being slowly removed. He wanted to fight. He wanted to open his eyes, but it was useless. Something held him back, something stronger than he could understand. When he finally managed to see something, he realized he was in a completely different place. It was a scene of desolation, a dry and cracked land where there was no life, just an intense heat that seemed to come from all sides. He felt as if the ground were alive, pulsing, emitting a heat that penetrated his skin and made him shiver. On the horizon, everything seemed to be on fire, but the flames did not illuminate. It was a fire that only increased the darkness. The silence of the place was disturbing, but even more terrifying was the sound that appeared every now and then. Distant screams, like the wails of people in agony. He tried to move, but his feet felt stuck to the floor. Every step he tried to take felt like he was sinking into something invisible but inescapable. The place seemed eternal. There was no beginning, no end. It was as if time didn't exist there, as if he were trapped in a void where every second lasted an eternity. Suddenly, he realized he was not alone. In the distance, he saw figures moving. They had no clear shape, but they conveyed an oppressive presence. It was as if the very air around them was being drained. He felt a chill run down his spine when he realized that those figures were watching him. Even without faces, he knew he was being analyzed, judged. He felt in his heart that those presences knew everything about him, every mistake, every choice, every thought. It was like being naked in the face of something you couldn't forgive. As I tried to process what was happening, a figure approached. Unlike the figure, it had a clear but grotesque shape. The skin looked burned, cracked, and the eyes were empty pits that conveyed only darkness. The creature stared at him with an intensity that made his entire body shake. Without moving his mouth, he heard her voice, deep and cutting, echoing inside his mind. "You belong to us." He wanted to scream, he wanted to run away, but he was paralyzed. Each word seemed to rip something out of him, as if he were being stripped of his very essence. The creature began to show things, images that passed before him like scenes from a movie, but that he knew were real. He saw moments of his life, choices he had made, things he would rather forget, small sins that he had ignored, believing they were unimportant, now seemed huge. He saw the moment he signed the contract. He saw the consequences of every decision he made since then. And, most frighteningly, he saw the fate that was in store for him, an endless abyss, where fire and darkness mixed, where souls screamed for help without ever receiving an answer. As this was happening, he realized something even more terrifying. There were other people there, lost souls he recognized, people he had known in life. Some he admired, some he despised, but they all shared the same fate. He saw a man who had been his mentor, someone he thought untouchable, now in complete despair, screaming for mercy. He saw women, children, people of all ages, all trapped in that eternal torment. And what shocked him most was realizing that they were all there because of choices that seemed insignificant in earthly life. Amidst the chaos, he heard a new voice. It was different from the first, calmer, but still powerful. It came from a distant point, a light he could barely see. The voice said, "I gave you chances. I called you. Why didn't you listen?" He tried to respond, tried to justify, but now words came out. He knew there were no excuses, that everything that was happening was a consequence of his own choices. And this is where I want you to reflect. Have you ever thought about the consequences of your choices? Have you ever stopped to think that every decision, no matter how small it may seem, can have an eternal impact? Leave the word consequence in the comment if this has ever crossed your mind. Let's share experiences and help each other understand the importance of each step we take. The light, although distant and weak, seemed to be the only relief in the midst of absolute chaos. But before he could get closer, he was once again pulled away by the dark presence that enveloped him. It was as if hell itself didn't want to let him escape, as if every step toward the light was an effort against an overwhelming force. The grotesque creature that had confronted him before appeared again, now even closer, its empty gaze boring into his mind and soul. He felt as if his entire existence was being ripped from the inside out, exposing not only his actions, but the intentions behind every choice he had made in life. And it was at that moment that he began to receive revelations. The creature pointed at him without moving its mouth, but its voice echoed in his mind like thunder. You chose this path. Everything you saw, everything you experienced was a result of the doors you opened. You are guilty, not us. The accusation weighed like an invisible chain. He wanted to deny it, wanted to scream that he didn't know what he was doing, but the images kept appearing, like memories he was trying to bury. Little moments that he thought were insignificant, little choices that seemed unimportant, now took on a gigantic dimension. It was as if each decision carried an echo that reverberated for eternity. He saw clearly how pride had led him to ruin. From the beginning, he always thought he could control everything, that he didn't need anyone. He trusted in money, power, and high-sown abilities, ignoring all the signs that warned him that something was wrong. And it was then that the creature revealed a terrifying truth. Pride is the root of your destruction. You put yourself in God's place. You thought you could write your own rule, but all you did was open the doors for us. These words echoed like a sentence, and he realized that hell was not just a distant destination he had already begun to live. It in life, from the moment he let his heart be taken over by these forces. The next revelation was even crueler. He began to understand how his actions, no matter how small, had affected other people. He saw faces he recognized, employees, friends, even strangers, whose lives had been negatively impacted by his selfish choices. He realized that by living for himself, he not only destroyed his own soul, but also dragged others into darkness. The creature pointed again, and he heard, "You think your actions have no consequences? Look at them. Each one you ignored, each one you hurt, they all bear the marks of your choices." He felt the weight of regret like an anchor, pulling him further into the abyss. The scenery around him began to change, as if hell itself was shaping his perceptions to amplify the torment. He was taken to a place where souls were trapped, each in a state of absolute despair. He saw people crying, screaming, trying to escape invisible chains that held them still. And the scariest thing was that these currents were not physical. They were made of guilt, of shame, of choices that these souls had made in life. Each was trapped in their own reality, reliving their mistakes over and over again, never finding relief. And he realized the same thing was happening to him. The voices that tormented him were not just external. They came from within, from the darkest parts of his own mind. But there was more. The creature revealed another truth, something he had never considered. You don't have to be dead to be in hell. Many already live in it every day, blind to the path they are taking. Those words hit him like a blow. He thought of hell as a distant place, something that would only happen after death. But now he understood that he was mistaken. Hell was a present reality, a state of mind, a condition of the soul that began long before the last breath. And he knew he wasn't alone. He saw familiar faces among the tormented soul, people he knew who lived as he had lived, obsessed with material, with appearances, with power. The creature then spoke for the last time. You received signs. You were warned, but you ignored them all. He remembered every moment he had felt that emptiness, every night when something inside him cried out for change, every person who had tried to help him and who he had pushed away. He realized that he had not been left without alternative. He just chose to ignore them. And now, there, in the midst of the torment, he understood that the biggest mistake he had made was not the pact, but having neglected the opportunities to seek something greater, something that could really fill the emptiness he felt. And now, I want you to think about something. Have you ever ignored clear signs that life gave you? Have you ever felt like you were following a path that could take you somewhere you couldn't escape? Write the word signs in the comment or share your experience. Let's talk about this, because sometimes what we need most is to recognize that the signs have always been there. You just need to see them. As he remained motionless, as if the very shackles of hell were keeping him bound, the scene around him changed again. The dark creatures that surrounded him retreated into the shadows, and he was led to a new vision, a revelation that was more personal, more terrifying. He was no longer alone in that place. Before him, figures began to appear. They weren't just indistinct figures, but real people he knew. He saw their faces clearly, even through the darkness and the flames that seemed to dance around each soul. They were friends, colleagues, people he had admired, and, most shockingly, people he had ignored. Every face carried an expression of utter despair. There was no mistaking what he was seeing. It was the kind of torment that came from within, a suffering that could not be alleviated. These people were trapped in their own mistakes, their own choices, and what was most disturbing was that he knew exactly what had led them there. He saw a former business partner who he had betrayed for financial advantage. The man, now in torment, was surrounded by piles of gold that melted and flowed like lava onto his skin, but he could not escape. He screamed, trying to push away the glowing gold, but it was useless. He saw a woman who used to move in the same social circles as him. She was known for her beauty, for her ability to manipulate others to get what she wanted. Now, his appearance was unrecognizable. Her skin appeared to have been eaten away by fire, and she held a broken mirror that reflected an even more grotesque version of herself. With each attempt to let go of the mirror, it returned to her hands as if it were part of her. Her screams were a mix of pain and despair, and he knew she was trapped in a cycle of self-comparison and vanity that had consumed her in life. As he walked, or was dragged, he saw more souls, each trapped in torments that seemed personalized, designed to amplify the pain of their earthly choices. There was a man he knew only by sight, someone who used to flaunt his strength and power over others. Now, he was chained up, constantly being crushed by rocks that seemed to present the weight of his arrogance. He struggled, but the chains never gave way, and the cycle of pain began again and again. These visions were not just frightening, they were deeply personal. Every soul he saw seemed to carry a message for him, as if hell was showing him not just the mistakes of others, but the choices he himself had made. He began to realize that he was connected to these people in ways he had never imagined. What he had ignored in life was now in front of him, inescapable, and he couldn't turn a blind eye to it. But what terrified him most wasn't just the physical torment he saw. It was the absolute emptiness in the eyes of these souls. Not only were they suffering, they were completely lost, without hope, without any possibility of redemption. He felt a tightness in his chest when he realized that, like him, they had received signs in life, opportunities to change, but they were ignored. He knew this because he saw flashes of their lives, moments when a different choice could have changed everything. But, like him, they had been blinded by pride, by greed, by vanity. He began to wonder, what if these souls had heard the warning? What if they had listened to that little inner voice we all have, the one that tells us to stop, to reflect, to choose the right path? He saw clearly how choices that seemed insignificant in life had an eternal weight, how each small deviation from the right path led, little by little, to that destination. And he couldn't help but wonder, how many of these choices had he himself made without realizing it? As he looked at those souls, he also felt something that made him shudder. They looked back at him, not with anger, but with a mixture of pleading and desperation. It was as if they wanted to warn him, as if, even in his torment, they wanted him to understand what he was seeing. But there were no words, only screams and pain echoed in the air, a sound that seemed to penetrate to the bones. And then the creature accompanying him spoke again, his voice as cold as before. "You see? This is what happens when they ignore the signs, when they live only for themselves. And you are no different. You are one of them. And soon it will be here too." Those words hit him like a blow. He tried to argue, tried to justify his choices, but the truth was inescapable. He knew that everything he was seeing could easily be his destiny. And now, I ask you, have you ever reflected on how your choices can impact not only your life, but also your eternity? Have you ever thought about the times you ignored signs that could save you from something bigger? Write in the comments, "I see," and share what went through your mind while listening to this. Let's talk, because sometimes seeing is the first step to change. Amidst that absolute chaos, surrounded by the souls in physical torment and the cruel words that echoed in his mind, he felt that everything was lost. The weight of the revelations was overwhelming, and the feeling that there was no way out was drowning him. He couldn't scream, he couldn't run, and each attempt to escape only deepened his connection to this place. It was as if the invisible chains of hell were tightening around him, pulling him into an eternal prison. He asked himself, "Is this how it ends? Is this my final destination?" As these questions echoed in his mind, something unexpected happened. On the dark and hazy horizon of that place, a small light began to emerge. At first, it seemed insignificant, almost imperceptible, a distant spark in the overwhelming darkness. But as he gazed in that direction, the light seemed to grow, gaining strength, as if something was struggling to break through the darkness. It was a light unlike any he had ever seen. It wasn't just a brightness, it was a presence. She carried warmth, comfort, and something he barely remembered feeling: hope. The light began to move, crossing that desperate scenario, as if it had a life of its own. With every step he took towards her, he felt something changing inside him. The weight in his chest seemed to lift, if only slightly. It was as if that light was pushing the darkness away, creating a bubble of protection around him. And then he heard a voice. It was soft but firm, as if it were speaking directly to his heart. "You still have a choice," it said. He didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to run toward the light, cling to it like a castaway finding a lifeline in the middle of the ocean, but another part was full of doubt, full of fear. He felt like he wasn't worthy, that he had gone too far, that light couldn't reach him after everything he had done. He tried to take a step, but his legs felt heavy, as if the chains of hell were holding him in place. "Do you think you can escape?" mocked the creature that had accompanied him there. "You've already made your choice. You're ours." The struggle within him was real. Every fiber of his being seemed to be divided between surrendering to that place or launching himself towards the light. But the voice continued. She was insistent, but not imposing. She called out to him as if she was patiently waiting for him to make the decision for himself. "I'm here. I've always been here. You just need to come to me." These words were like water to a thirsty soul, but at the same time, they awoke a deep fear. He knew that if he decided to follow the light, he would have to give up everything: his pride, his justifications, his vision of control. Finally, he found the strength to whisper, almost soundlessly, "Help me." And in that instant, something changed. The light intensified, enveloping him completely, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years: relief. It wasn't just a physical relief, but something deeper, as if the chains holding him back were being broken one by one. He felt like he could breathe again, that there was something stronger than the darkness that surrounded him. But hell did not surrender so easily. The shadows around him began to stir, as if resisting the presence of that light. The creature tormenting him screamed with inhuman fury, charging towards him. But before he could reach it, the light came between them, like a shield. He didn't know where that protection came from, but he knew he was safe. And then he heard the voice again. "You are not alone. I came for you." It was at that moment that he realized that light was not just a force. It was a person, a presence that exuded love, justice, and power. He couldn't see clearly, but he felt like he was facing something divine, something that was greater than anything he could imagine. He felt small, insignificant, but at the same time accepted, like he was deeply known and yet loved. The light began to completely envelop him, and he felt as if he was being lifted from that place. The heat was comforting, but also purifying, as if it was burning away everything impure within him. He wanted to ask, wanted to understand what was happening, but before he could speak, the voice said once again, "I gave you another chance. Don't waste it." Suddenly, he woke up. He was back in his room, but something had changed. The weight he carried was gone. The shadows that surrounded him were no longer there. He knew something supernatural had happened, something he could never fully explain. He sat up in bed, still feeling the warmth of that light, and for the first time in a long time, he cried, not out of despair, but out of relief, out of gratitude. Now, I want you to reflect with me. How many times has life given you a second chance that you ignored? How many times has the light tried to reach you, but you chose to stay in darkness? Write in the comments, "New chance," if you have ever felt that God or destiny were calling you back to the right path. Let's talk about it, because sometimes all we need is to recognize that the light is there, waiting for us. The call to transformation, the experience he had lived through felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. The warmth of that light still lingered on his skin, like a vivid reminder that something great had happened. But at the same time, he felt the weight of the revelations he had received. Those images of hell, the scream, the lost souls, everything still echoed in his mind, like a constant warning. He couldn't just ignore it. Something inside him had changed, and he knew that this transformation wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. He could no longer go back to who he was before. As he sat on his bed, reliving every detail of what had happened, he began to realize how much his life up to that point had been built on a false foundation. He thought he was powerful, that he had control, that his riches and achievements protected him from everything. But now he knew the truth. He had been mistaken. All of his decisions, his mistakes, and even his successes were rooted in a selfish desire to fill the void that ultimately brought him to the brink of perdition. He couldn't help but wonder, how did I get to this point? What caused me to ignore the signs so much throughout my life? The questions were many, but for the first time, he was willing to seek answers. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He recognized that the light that had rescued him was something greater than himself, greater than anything he could comprehend. It was something divine, something he had not valued or sought before. And this made him realize a truth that, until then, he had ignored. He needed God, not a distant concept or idea, but a real relationship, a genuine connection that could guide you and transform the chaos in your life. But how to start? He didn't know where to start. All he knew was that he needed to change. His house, full of luxury, seemed cold and empty now. The objects he had accumulated over the years, cars, jewelry, works of art, no longer meant anything to him. It was as if he was seeing everything with different eyes. What he once valued above all else now felt heavy, purposeless, a constant reminder of everything he had put first in his life while ignoring what truly mattered. He began to pace the house, feeling an uneasiness that he knew he couldn't ignore. Every step seemed charged with symbolism, as if he was literally leaving behind the life he knew. As he passed his office, he stopped and looked at the desk where it all began. There was the contract, the symbol of his downfall. He looked at the paper, feeling a mixture of regret and anger. How could he be so blind? But at the same time, he felt a spark of hope, because despite everything, he had been given a chance to change. And he knew this chance was a gift he couldn't waste. It was there, at that moment, that he fell to his knees. He didn't know how to pray. He had never really prayed before, but the words began to come out, clumsy, broken, but sincere. He confessed everything, his mistakes, his choices, his pride. He begged for forgiveness, asked for direction, and most of all, he was grateful for the chance to be alive, to be able to change. And as he prayed, something began to happen. He felt a peace he couldn't explain, a peace that seemed to fill every empty corner of his soul. It was as if the light he had seen in hell was now inside him, guiding him, giving him the strength to carry on. In the days that followed, he began to make small but significant decisions. He knew the transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to take it one step at a time. He started looking for help, connecting with people who could guide him spiritually. He began giving away his possession, not out of guilt, but because he wanted what once held him back could now be used to help other people. He knew that his riches were not necessarily a problem, but how he used them determined whether they were a blessing or a curse. Each day brought new challenges, but also new victories. He began to understand that transformation was not just about leaving behind his past, but about building something new, something that had purpose. He began to feel that, for the first time in his life, he was truly living. He still had a lot to learn, a lot to change, but now he wasn't alone. He felt the presence of that light, of that God who had rescued him, guiding him at every step. And now I ask you, who are watching, have you ever felt like you needed to change something in your life, but didn't know where to start? Have you ever felt that, even after everything, there was still a chance for you? If so, write in the comments, "I accept," or share your story. Let's talk about it, because Like him, we can all find transformation when we choose to hear the call. When he opened his eyes that morning, something was different. It wasn't just the lightness he felt in his body, as if an invisible weight had been lifted, but the very way he saw the world had changed. Everything seemed more alive, more meaningful. The silence that once tormented him was now welcoming. There was no longer that screaming emptiness that echoed in his mind. In its place, there was a purpose that he didn't yet fully understand, but that he knew he would need to pursue. He was no longer alone. Something greater, something more powerful, now dwelt within him. The days that followed were marked by an internal battle. Although the supernatural experience had changed his life, he knew the fight was far from over. He was still tempted to return to his old ways, to seek comfort in the material things that once defined his existence. But whenever these temptations arose, he remembered what he had seen in hell. He remembered the scream, the lost souls, the despair that seemed to have no end. He knew he couldn't let this go in vain. His life now had a new purpose, and he was determined to fulfill it. He began to reflect on what it meant to live a purposeful life. For years, he had chased success, money, and status, but now he saw these things as tools rather than end goals. He realized that everything he had, his influence, his resources, even his experience, could be used for something much bigger than himself. For the first time, he understood that his life wasn't just about him. He had been rescued for a greater reason, a mission that was still being revealed to him, but that he knew he couldn't ignore. The first thing he did was look for the people he had hurt in the past. He knew that asking for forgiveness would be difficult, but it was necessary. He began reaching out to old co-workers, friends he had betrayed, and even family members he had neglected. He listened to their stories, acknowledged their mistakes, and, in many cases, cried along with them. It wasn't easy, but he felt this process was part of his transformation. Each forgiveness received was like a piece of his soul being restored. He also started sharing his story. At first, he hesitated. After all, how could he talk about something so supernatural in such a skeptical world? But he knew his experience wasn't just for him. He had been saved to be a voice, to warn others about what he had seen and the consequences of the choices we make every day. He started small, speaking to groups of people nearby, but soon his message began to spread. People wanted to hear his story. They wanted to understand how someone who had everything could have come so close to the abyss, and how he had found a second chance. Each time he told his story, he felt something inside him grow stronger. It was as if, by sharing, he was reinforcing his new mission, reaffirming his commitment to the transformation he had begun. He talked about the importance of choices, about how every decision we make carries eternal weight. He talked about hell, not as an abstract idea, but as something real, something he had experienced and did not wish on anyone. But most of all, he talked about light. He talked about rescue, about the hope that, even in the darkest moments, there is a way back. But it wasn't just with words that he wanted to make an impact. He began using his resources to help people who were in desperate situations, just as he had been. He funded rehabilitation programs, supported families in financial difficulty, and invested in initiatives that helped young people find purpose in their lives. He knew his mission was not just to talk, but to act. He wanted to be a living example that change is possible, that there is hope even for those who think they have gone too far. The journey, however, was not without challenge. He faced criticism, people who doubted his transformation, who thought he was just trying to clean up his image, but he didn't let himself be shaken. He knew that his mission was not to please everyone, but to be faithful to what he was called to do. He knew that as long as he was following the light, as long as he was listening to the voice that had rescued him, he was on the right path. And now, he wants you to know that there is a purpose for your life too. He wants you to understand that no matter how far you think you've gone, there is always a way back. He is living proof that God can transform even the most desperate situations. And just as he was called to this new mission, you can be called too. Your life has value. Your choices matter. And now I ask you, have you ever felt like there is something bigger calling you, but you are afraid to respond? Have you ever felt like your life could be more than what you are living now? Write in the comment, "I accept my mission," or share what God has spoken to your heart. Let's discover together how we can transform our lives and impact the world around you. If you've come this far, it wasn't by chance. It's because, in some way, this message touched your heart, brought reflections, and perhaps even a call to something greater. We believe that God uses simple moments like this to reach us, to speak directly to our soul, and remind us that He is always present, even in the most difficult situation. Therefore, we want to know, how did this video impact you? Share the phrase in the comments, "I felt God's voice in this video," and tell us how this message spoke to you. Don't be afraid to open your heart. Sometimes what you share can be exactly what someone else needs to read to find strength and hope. Your experience can be a living testimony to inspire and help others who are also seeking answers. Also, remember that this journey doesn't have to be lonely. Be part of this community that seeks transformation, connection, and purpose. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving content that not only informs but transforms lives. By activating the bell, you guarantee that you will never miss the next messages that we have prepared with so much care and purpose. Also, don't forget to leave your like. This is more than a simple gesture. It's a way for you to support this mission of spreading hope and truth to as many people as possible. Your engagement makes all the difference so that this message reaches those who need it most. And before you leave, take the opportunity to watch the next video that is now available on the final screen. Each content is designed to complement this journey of spiritual growth and reflection, helping you walk closer to God and understand the plans He has for your life. May God powerfully bless you, your family, and everything you put your hands to do. May He continue to guide your steps, light your path, and show you that, regardless of how far you have gone, there is always a chance to start again. Thank you for being here, for listening to this message, and for allowing it to touch your heart. See you in the next video.